So hi everyone and welcome to this video. I just finished taking the XAT 2023 paper a few hours back and quickly wanted to put out an early evaluation of what I felt about the paper. So this session is going to be all about that. At the very beginning, let me give you a very strong disclaimer that I have not spoken to any of the students regarding how they felt about this paper. This entire evaluation is completely based on my own experience. So whatever evaluation I'm passing out here might not be a true reflection of the paper because it is going to be colored by my own personal biases, my own personal expertise, my own personal knowledge or lack thereof. So the predictions that I'm going to make based on my own evaluation might be completely off. It might not be anywhere close to reality. It might not be anywhere close to what the actual cutoffs and scores are going to be. But I still want to take a shot and I'm going to talk about what I felt regarding the paper. And maybe some of you can relate to it and maybe it makes a bit of sense. Okay. So with that being said, let me get into this video. Firstly, I want to talk about the new features and surprises which are present inside the paper. Firstly, the number of questions and duration, right? Even though XAT had put out how many questions are going to be there in each section and how the 3.5 hours durations is going to get divided into part 1 and part 2 of the paper beforehand itself on their website. But still, this is something that has changed from the last year. Last year for part 1, we had only 165 minutes. This year, we had 10 more minutes for exactly one extra question of decision making. So 76 questions instead of 75 questions for VA, DM, and QA combined together. And instead of 165 minutes for these three sections, we had 175 minutes. And it, in my personal opinion, made a bit more sense. I think the kind of paper that they created demanded that they increase the 10 minutes. So it did not feel out of place. The philosophy of XAT always has been that they don't want students to scramble for time. They want to judge candidates based on their performance when time is not a major constraint. And I think XAT absolutely succeeded in doing that. If someone has taken this paper very seriously, very, very patiently, they could have made use of each and every minute of these 175 minutes. I didn't feel that this paper was unnecessarily lengthened. Apart from that, before part 2, we had a 5-minute a test of typing, whether the keyboard is working fine for the computers or not. And I think that was a needed feature. Last year, several students complained that when they started typing out the essay, then a lot of keyboards and keys were not working and few test centers faced a lot of issues. So it is a reactive measure on the part of XAT that they have learned from the previous experiences and they have imparted this feature into the paper. So I feel that that's a very good sense of analysis and a sense of feedback taking from these say test takers, and they should definitely be applauded for this. So that's the first thing. Number of questions and duration was changed. Second thing, which was a surprise, was that LR questions made a comeback into the DM section. Last year, as well as the year before that, DM was purely a decision-making section. Logical reasoning questions per se were not part of the paper. Although in previous years, before 2020, there were papers in which decision-making section did have 1 or 2 sets of LR, and they again made a comeback into this year's paper. Third surprise is that there was a trigonometry question and not a heights and distances or application of trigonometry question. A fundamental hardcore trigonometry simplification question was present inside the QA section, which at least I did not foresee coming. So that was definitely a curveball. And finally, I will have to single out the DI questions, especially that DI in which 3 graphs were given. They were very complex. They were not easy to comprehend. They were not easy to understand. Unlike last few years where the DI was pretty standard, this year DI felt a bit different. In fact, I would say even the second DI set in which the table was given of the COVID patient and COVID cases, even that felt slightly different, although not as much as the 3 graph DI set did. So that was also a bit of a surprise for me, right? Moving forward, let me look at the 3 sections and talk about what I felt about the 3 sections and the difficulty levels of those 3 sections. Firstly, talking about the VA section, I felt the grammar questions were standard. Grammar is not easy for most students, and generally XAT questions, the sentence correction questions, are of the same type that were present in this year's paper as well. There is nothing different about it. At the same time, I won't say grammar was easy. XAT grammar is always a bit complex, a bit difficult, and this year was no different, but it was as expected. The critical reasoning questions, I felt that last year, a few more critical reasoning questions were doable than the critical reasoning questions this year were. This year, the questions were pretty confusing, especially the options were very close together. There were a couple of further applications questions, like what would you write after the sentence? Those questions were relatively easier as compared to the strengthening and weakening of arguments questions. And also the inference or conclusion-based questions were tough. I would not call them moderate even. I would say they were tough. The options were pretty confusing. So that is something about critical reasoning that everyone would have felt a pinch that while they're taking the paper, that they are being made to think a bit harder to get to the correct answer. And finally, reading comprehensions. I am a reading comprehension trainer, and I have seen reading comprehension passages of XAT as well as CAT over the years. And I felt personally that definitely this year's reading comprehension questions were on the tougher side. So if you feel that you are very confused and you had to leave out a few reading comprehension questions because you could not make sense of the options, then you are not alone, and that is not a wrong sense of evaluation. You don't need to fear having lesser number of attempts or the feeling that you have not done well inside the RC section of the VA part. If that is the case, don't worry. Everyone would have and should have felt that the reading comprehension questions were difficult. Although I would say that XAT reading comprehension passages are generally very interesting to read. At least personally, I find them to be extremely nice and thought-provoking content. And this year was no different. I felt the global warming passage was pretty standard. It was a kind of a passage that you would expect even inside the CAT paper. But the remaining two passages and the poem were beautiful. I felt the procrastination passage was very thought-provoking. I felt the storytelling is very, very relevant in today's political scenario, and I could relate to it a lot. And the poem was beautiful. Anyone who enjoys poetry would have actually appreciated the depth of content. Although the questions were not as beautiful as the passages and the poems were, the questions were very confusing. The options were very close together. So reading comprehension questions were tough as a whole. So if I look at the VA section, my verdict is that this part of the paper was tough. And when I say tough, I mean tougher than the previous years. So at least if I compare it to XAT 2022, I would say that this year's VA section is definitely a notch tougher than XAT 2022 paper. Right, moving on to the second section, the DM section. I felt that two of the sets were a bit tricky. The questions were tricky. You had to evaluate the options very carefully to figure out what the answer was. One was, I think, the tea plant question, the tea question that was, I think, a bit difficult to gauge. And then there was one more set, I think, about Niyabuddin. Even that set was not very easy to deal with. But apart from that, there were two sets which I felt were occasionally simple, because one was about moonlighting. It was not exactly a situation. I felt that that was very doable. And even the slum set, the slum set in which the girl Dhan tries to start her own TCS. By the way, I felt that whoever has made that set has done an excellent job of incorporating TCS. I had a laugh while I was reading that TCS stands for tea comes savory stall. So very well incorporated. I felt that it was a nod to the fact that XLRI is in Jamshedpur, and they wanted to pay some kind of tribute to the Tata. So they put TCS inside the set. Beautifully crafted set. And the questions, if you read them carefully, you could have actually figured out the answers pretty easily in that particular set. So of the 4 DM sets, I felt that 2 were a bit tricky, as is the case generally with XAT DM sets. 2 sets were simple. Of course, I can be absolutely wrong here, because oftentimes I feel that a set is simple, and then when I look at the answer key, it doesn't make sense to me at all. So we have to wait for the answer key to figure out that whether the DDM section was easy or not. But I felt that the 4 DMs sets make the DM section a bit easy. The set of LR was, in my head, it was doable. Anyone who was prepared for CAT's LRDI section would know how to approach this set. You just had to read the instructions very carefully, the data very carefully. And if you have understood the set, I felt that you could have figured out what the answer is. A bit of calculation was required. But yeah, if you could make the calculations with your own hand and not use calculators, I think it was a pretty doable set of LR. Overall verdict, I would say that DM was easier than previous years. See, by no means am I saying that the DM section was easy as a blanket statement. I'm saying as compared to XAT 2020, 21, and 22. This year's XAT 23's DM section was definitely on the slightly easier side. That's what I felt. I felt that more number of answers I could come up with concretely rather than being confused with the options. So easier than previous years is the verdict for the DM section. And finally, the last of part 1, the QA section. The QA section, the questions were lengthy. Generally, XAT has a propensity of giving wordy questions, right, in which lots of words are there. You have to read the question very carefully. It seems like a reading comprehension passage to understand what the question is about. This year was again the same. You had to read the questions very, very patiently to understand what has been asked. And even arriving at the answers was not a quick task. I felt that the questions were lengthy. And contrary to XAT's philosophy, XAT does not give you an on-screen calculator. Why? Because they don't set generally questions which are very calculation intensive. But contrary to that, I felt that they went slightly against the philosophy. A few questions were definitely calculation intensive as well, which made the QA section pretty lengthy. So if you felt that you did not have a lot of time to sit and ponder over questions, and you had to again be a bit selective in terms of picking up the questions, and you did not have time to work out say longer questions, that's what I felt as well. So lengthy section for sure. There were a couple of sitters in which the questions are direct. I think there were some mixtures and allegations questions which had a lot of unnecessary data which has been given, and the answer was directly present in the question itself. So I think one or two sitters of that type were present inside the paper. But apart from that, overall, the questions were not very easy. Data sufficiency questions, I think there were two. I might be mistaken here. I remember two. Both the questions I felt were a bit tricky. It's not like at face value. You can look at the questions and say what the answer is. Definitely not the case. So you do require to work out what might be the answer of both these data sufficiency problems. And finally, DI, as I mentioned before, pretty complicated DI. Both DIs were actually difficult. Although not say calculation intensive, but still the kind of questions that were asked required a lot of analyzing the data properly, looking at the graphs properly, and thinking about the options. That is this option, has this option been indicated by the data or not? That kind of thought-provoking questions were present. So definitely complicated DI. So all these put together, I would say the QA section was tedious and tough. When I took XAT 22 paper, after finishing the QA section, I still had about 20 minutes left where I did not know what to do with the paper, and I had left about 5 questions inside the QA section. This year, though, when I finished the QA section, even though I have a very fast reading speed and I got done with VA and DM with 90 minutes in hand, I spent the entire 1.5 hours going through the QA section questions, and I feel that had I had 5 more minutes, I could have attempted more questions. Even though I attempted 22 questions, I still feel, not 22, sorry, 24 questions. Even then, I feel that for the last 4 questions, if I had a bit more time, maybe I could have solved 1 or 2 more. So that in itself is an indicator that if I take 1.5 hours and I'm still not being able to do justice to 28 questions, that definitely indicates that the QA section questions were long, tedious, and tough. Basically not because very complicated concepts were asked, but then evaluating the language, understanding exactly what the question is asking, number of steps required to get to the correct answer, having a very strong base, say foundation of concepts and fundamentals was definitely required to get a good score inside the QA section. Right, moving on to part 2. Part 2, I'm not going to give you a verdict, but generally I felt that current affairs was the flavor of GK. I think everywhere, anyone who has been following current affairs of sports, of politics, of general scientific development across the world, Ukraine war, everything was asked inside the paper. So anyone who has been following the news should be able to solve at least 7 to 8 questions. There were a few static GK questions, but I feel that 7 to 8 questions were easily doable inside, say, the GK part of the paper for everyone. Essay topics were standard, nothing fancy to speak of. I felt that anyone, without even having knowledge of current affairs or without even having knowledge of topics, can write about their own opinions and agree or disagree with the argument that has been given inside the topics. Right. So no curveballs here. I think part 2 was smooth sailing and should have been smooth sailing for most of us. Right. Now, quickly going to talk about the predictive cutoffs from my side. I felt that the VA cutoff is going to go a bit lower. So I personally, if you ask me, I feel that the VA cutoffs for both BM and HR should be 7 point something. It should not be more than that, considering the level of difficulty that this year's reading comprehension questions had, and also critical reasoning questions had. So in my opinion, it's going to be 7 point something, but I feel that, I had been very dumb while I was taking the paper, and maybe I did not read the questions well enough. So if I have performed badly, then I would feel, then it might go in 8 point something. I do not see the VA cutoff at all crossing the 9 mark for either BM or HR. DM section though, I'm fairly confident that it is going to go higher than the cutoffs for last year. I think last year for the BM program, the DM cutoff was 5 point something. I don't think it's going to be 5 point something this year. I feel that it should touch 7. Even if it doesn't touch 7, it should be slightly lesser than 7. I don't see it going lesser than 6.5 though for BM. And I feel for HR, it should definitely cross 7. Right? The higher end I have just put again because if I have widely underestimated the difficulty level of the paper or overestimated the difficulty level of the paper and I have done very poorly, then it is possible to go high. But I don't see, even though the DM section was easy, I don't see the DM cutoff going in double digits even for HR. I might be wrong here, but I feel that 7 is the ballpark that I would expect the DM cutoff to go for both BM and HR. HR slightly higher. HR might touch 8. BM definitely, I don't think that the DM cutoff for the BM program, for the business management program, is going to even touch 8. Then finally coming to the QA section. QA section, I think for the business management program last year, the cutoff was 13 point something. I don't see it going to 13 at all this year. I would predict the QA cutoff for BM program this year to be around the 11.5 ballpark. And for HR, I would predict it to be around 10.5 ballpark. Right. Overall cutoffs, because of this reason, I see it going down as well, because generally cutoffs go higher in XAT when the QA section is easy and the cutoffs for QA go higher, because that is where most students tend to maximize their overall scores. But this year, because QA was tough, I feel that 1 or 2 points can be taken off the overall cutoffs as well. Business management cutoff, I feel, should go around 32. Between 31.5 and 32 is my take. Maybe it might touch 32. I don't see it touching 33 at all. HR, I've said 30 to 31. I feel that 30 point something is the most possible cutoff. I will not be surprised if for HR program, the overall cutoff goes at 29 point something as well this year. I don't see it going lower than 29 for sure. But I think that 30s, or if my evaluation of the paper has been fair, then I feel that 29.5 to 30 is also a possible cutoff for the HR program this year. So this is right now on that day, the predictions that I'm making. Once the response key comes out, maybe my sense of understanding and judgment might change. Finally, things to remember. First thing I want you all to remember is that XAT generally releases the question paper first, right? And in that, your responses will not be present. The answer key also is not present. They just release the question paper. I don't know why they do that. They do that to create panic in the minds of the students, so that they go to different websites and figure out what the solutions are. And then based on that, they calculate the scores and then they get frightened, right? So for whatever reasons, that decides to torture students by first releasing the question paper separately. But if your responses are not there and the answers are not there, don't worry about it. The response key generally is released separately a few days before they release the actual results. So the response key will come separately. So if the question paper you receive, you say download the PDF from the XAT website and you see that your responses are not there, there is nothing to panic. It does not mean that you have not taken the paper. So remember that this is what XAT generally does. Okay. So first thing I want you to remember. Second thing, as I always say, I want you to remember is have fun. It's an examination. It's just a small part of your life. If you feel that you have not done well enough, if you have not done well in CAT and XAT also has not gone well enough in your own mind, don't worry about it. It's just an examination. It is not a major part of your life. Don't stress out. The major exams of this academic cycle are over. So remember to de-stress and have fun. Right? That's all from me for this video. So thank you everyone for watching, and click like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you.